back off. How can something like you get in here? Get out of here quickly. Where are the security guards? Drag this guy out.
Lobby, 9:01 a.m. Wood panels gleam. The air runs cold. A man in a dark turtleneck steps to the desk. Before he finishes his name, the receptionist slices the air with a finger. No badge. You don't belong here. Get lost. A long bleep swallows the final word. Keyboard stop. Even the elevator holds its breath. He doesn't flinch. Eyes flick to the clock. 1, 2. Thank you, he says. Steady. That tells me everything. He taps a number. Lights stutter. Access resets. And within minutes, this entire company is about to go dark. The lobby hums with morning energy. Wood panels glow with a clean polish. The air carries a faint citrus note from the floor cleaner. A man in a dark turtleneck steps to the reception counter and sets his palm lightly on the edge. He waits until the receptionist looks up. She glances past him first, as if scanning for someone else who fits her idea of importance, then lands on him with a practiced smile that does not reach her eyes. He states his name slowly and asks to see the chief operating officer. Her fingers never pause on the keyboard. She says that walk-ins are not on the list and that there is a waiting area to the side. He repeats his name, calm and steady, and adds that the COO is expecting him. The colleague seated to her left shifts in his chair, but says nothing. Another colleague at the center keeps typing, eyes fixed on the screen. The receptionist straightens, points toward the lounge seats, and talks over the end of his sentence. She tells him there are rules. Badge first, appointment code second, identity third. She leans into each word as if they are checkpoints she owns. He does not raise his voice or move his hands. He only asks that she verify the calendar. She exhales in a small theatrical puff. There is a brief pause while she pretends to search. Then she shakes her head and tells him again to step aside. The man to her left watches the exchange and blinks twice, a private signal of doubt that he lets die on his lips. A passerby taps a card at the gate. The reader chirps. The sound lands between them like a verdict. The receptionist tilts her chin and says, "He does not belong past this desk." Her voice sharpens. She tosses in an insult that pushes the room into silence. Keyboards stop. Even the elevator doors hesitate before closing. The word hangs there, ugly and heavy, then fades into the hush. He does not flinch. He looks at the wall clock. 9:01. He studies the second hand for 2 ticks, as if he is measuring the building's heartbeat. "Thank you," he says, and the words are gentle. That tells me everything. He takes out a phone, taps a single contact, and listens. "Proceed," he says, and pockets the device. Nothing changes for a breath. Then the monitors at the security podium refresh. The access list updates. The colleague at the center finally looks up, his posture breaking from scripted ease to puzzled concern. A low tone ripples from the intercom. The receptionist glances at her screen, confused by a cascade of system messages. She starts to say that there must be a network issue. He stands with the same quiet posture, as if watching the tide turn on a calm beach. Double doors at the far end open. The chief operating officer strides in, followed by legal and facilities. The COO addresses the man with respect that fills the space the insult tried to claim. "Sir, we were not informed you would arrive this morning." He nods once. The receptionist's face drains as she pieces it together. The man she dismissed is not a visitor and not a vendor. He is the new owner and acting chief executive. He does not seek an apology. He does not raise his voice. He asks the COO to carry out the scheduled audit and to initiate the pause protocol for operations. Compliance first, culture review next. The request is crisp, almost routine, but the effect is anything but. Email alerts begin to bloom on screens around the lobby. Accounts will sign out shortly. Non-essential systems will be suspended. Facilities will guide teams to temporary work areas. The announcements unfurl in clean corporate language that still leaves the staff breathless. He turns to leave. His palm lifts from the counter, and the polished wood shows a faint oval of warmth that cools at once. The receptionist tries to speak, but the words trip over apologies she has not yet formed. The colleague on the left finally finds his voice and tells her he should have stepped in. She stares at her hands, the authority gone from them. The lesson rings louder than any reprimand. What a company allows at the front desk is what it teaches about power. He reaches the door. The building's air feels different now, lighter and colder at the same time. Somewhere behind him, a printer stops mid-page. The elevator chimes, then resets. He pauses for a heartbeat, not for effect, but for clarity. This is not revenge. It is a standard being set. Then he walks out, leaving the lobby to catch up with what it has just shown him. The elevators release a small wave of people into the corridor outside the executive floor. Voices braid into a nervous hush as assistants usher department heads toward a glass-walled conference room. The man in the dark turtleneck takes the end seat and places his phone face down beside a thin folder. The chief operating officer sits to his right, legal counsel to his left, and the head of people operations takes a chair opposite. No one reaches for coffee. The room smells faintly of dry erase markers and recycled air. He begins without preamble. Today is not a fire drill. We will pause customer-facing operations for a limited window, complete the acquisition, transition controls, and run a culture and compliance audit that starts at the front door and ends at the board. The COO nods and pushes a printed playbook into the center of the table. The steps are already charted. Suspend privileged access not tied to business-critical functions, archive security footage, and lobby audio. Pull visitor logs for the past 90 days. Legal adds a quiet instruction to preserve all relevant communications. People operations will assemble an interview panel with rotating observers so that no one person owns the narrative. He turns one page in his folder, his voice stays level. We are not hunting villains, we are mapping systems. What happened at reception is a symptom. If a symptom appears at your front desk, it exists in hiring funnels, in performance reviews, in vendor selection, in how we greet a courier and how we greet a candidate. The head of people writes that down and draws a box around it. She suggests starting with blind replays of recorded lobby interactions to spot patterns. Who gets extra questions? Who gets waved through? Who gets the phone call instead of a form? He approves and sets a 48-hour deadline for the first readout. A comms director arrives, breathless. She has drafted an internal message for employees and a short notice to major clients. He asks her to read it aloud. The first sentence apologizes for disruption and blames network maintenance. He raises a hand. Tell the truth as cleanly as possible. Operations are paused to complete post-acquisition reviews and to address concerns about our guest experience and workplace conduct. There is no scandal in honoring standards. The director swallows and rewrites on the spot. A second draft lands with the quiet weight of clarity. He approves it and asks for a town hall in 2 hours, cameras on, chat open, moderation in place. Downstairs, the lobby has changed temperature. Facilities has set up a privacy screen around the reception station so that HR can conduct its first interview out of the public gaze. The receptionist sits very straight, hands together, eyes on a knot in the wood. The HR lead explains the process and writes, then asks for a step-by-step account. The young woman gives it in clipped sentences that slow whenever she reaches the moment the room went silent. She says she was following the rules. She says she thought he was trying to bypass the system. She admits she used a word she should never have used. She says she is sorry and that she does not know why it came out of her mouth that way. The HR lead listens without adding judgment to the air. Consequences will come from policy, but the report will focus on root causes as well as individual conduct. Security begins to surface logs. Patterns emerge. Certain surnames get flagged more often for additional ID checks, even when all documents are in order. Certain visitors are asked to repeat their purpose 3 times when others are greeted by name and waved to the lifts. The head of IT pairs with legal to track how these choices correlate with calendar entries and company events. Bias is not a ghost. It leaves timestamps. Upstairs, the man in the turtleneck meets with the COO and the Director of Customer Success. He asks for a list of active deals and critical support tickets. He does not want revenue harmed beyond the announced pause. They design a skeleton crew with explicit behavioral checkpoints, 2-person verifications for all urgent calls, scripts that remove loaded phrasing, a quiet line for clients to report negative interactions without navigating a maze. He emphasizes that the goal is not fear, it is trust. A company that treats strangers with dignity earns the right to manage their problems. At noon, the town hall begins. Thousands of faces tile across the screen. He keeps his message brief. This will be uncomfortable and it will be precise. We will protect the dignity of colleagues and guests while we protect the business. We will not drag anyone through public shame. We will also not blur the truth. He describes the pause, the audit, and the timeline for resuming operations. Questions flood the chat. He answers the ones that speak to processes, not gossip. He does not name the receptionist. He does not recount the word. He names the standard, the gap, and the path to close it. The call ends not with applause, but with a steadier kind of silence. By evening, the first recommendations arrive. Replace the single gatekeeper model with a two-layered welcome team trained in de-escalation and bias interruption. Add visible signage that explains steps and rights so visitors encounter a script before they encounter a person. Rotate staff away from the desk after prolonged conflicts to avoid decision fatigue. Require annual calibration of access control policies using anonymized case studies drawn from real incidents. He reads the list line by line, signs the temporary measures into effect, and schedules the rest for board review. The building grows quiet. In the lobby, the privacy screen comes down. Tomorrow will bring more interviews and a longer memo. Tonight brings a modest but irreversible shift. The front desk is no longer a stage for assumptions. It is the first proof point of the company they are building. Morning returns with a colder light and a quieter lobby. Facilities have replaced the lone reception station with a twin counter, 2 seats set at a slight angle so that no single person faces the full weight of the room. A printed sign stands at eye level. Welcome. Identification and purpose. Your rights, your options. It is plain language, no slogans, a map more than a poster. The first visitors arrive early. They read the steps, nod, and move through with steadier shoulders. A security guard stands 2 paces back, not looming, simply present. Upstairs, interview rooms rotate employees every 40 minutes. People's operations keep the tone neutral. Tell us about your first month here. Tell us about the hardest day at the desk. Tell us about a time the rule book was not enough. The accounts are not sensational. They are human and specific. A courier refused by name because his company was unfamiliar. A candidate who waited an hour while 3 calls went to the wrong extension. A senior partner who received coffee without showing ID because everyone knew his face. Patterns form where stories overlap. The head of people draws a diagram on a legal pad that connects fatigue, ambiguity, pressure, status cues, and the convenient myth that there is no time to verify with kindness. The woman who worked reception returns for a second conversation. HR presents policy, documented training records, and the company code of conduct she signed. There is no theater. She reads the line that names the slur plainly, and she does not look away. She admits her choice without evasions. She describes a morning that began badly and a head full of other frustrations that were not his to carry. HR explains outcomes. A termination for cause is on the table. She exhales once, then asks for a reference that reflects the years she worked before this day. HR says they cannot do that. She nods. She asks if she can write an apology that is specific and private, and if it can be acknowledged without becoming a spectacle. HR agrees to deliver it through counsel. After she leaves the room, the air feels thinner. Consequences matter, but so does the refusal to turn a person into a headline. Midday, the COO and legal bring the first wave of audit data. Anomalies and access challenges cluster around unstructured hours, especially near-shift changes when the desk is short-staffed. Bias spiked when stress spiked. The fix is not only training, it is staffing, break cadence, and a dead, simple escalation path. The COO proposes an always available back channel number staffed by a rotating senior admin who can authorize exceptions or verify appointments in less than 1 minute. The CEO approves and asks for scripts that frame escalation as care, not punishment. Customer success reports on the pause. No critical failures. A few impatient emails. One client writes back to say they appreciate the candor and that they have had to learn the same lesson the hard way. The skeleton crew logs a dozen calls where the new language changed the tone of the conversation. Thank you for calling. I can help. Here are the steps. Here are your choices. People move faster when dignity is not treated like a luxury. Late afternoon brings a different kind of meeting. The CEO asks 5 employees from varied levels to join a round table with him and the COO. No cameras, no notes. He asks a single question. What would make it easier to do the right thing when the day turns narrow and loud? They talk about scripts that disappear when tempers rise. They talk about badges that do not read properly for guests of color because names are truncated by a legacy system built for short lists. They talk about the way power announces itself through small courtesies, like who gets an apology when the system glitches. The CEO listens and asks whether they would be willing to help build the new onboarding module. They say yes before he finishes the sentence. Evening again. The operations dashboard shows clean green lines. The lobby camera captures a small moment that no one will put in a memo. An intern arrives for a late interview slot, anxious and early. The new welcome team greets him by name because the calendar sync finally works. They explain the process and hand him a printed sheet that matches the sign. He asks a nervous question about whether his student ID is enough. The second receptionist answers yes and also offers to hold his backpack behind the counter so he does not worry about it in the elevator. He thanks them twice. He steps into the lift, a different person than the one who walked through the door. The CEO walks through the lobby at close. He takes in the sign, the paired desks, the angle of the chairs. He nods to the guard. He pauses where he stood the previous morning and lets the scene overwrite what happened here. It will not erase it. It does not need to. The point is not to forget. It is to prove a different reflex. Standards, then systems, then habits. He leaves the building with the quiet certainty of work that has begun rather than ended. Outside, the glass reflects a city that keeps moving. Inside, a company learns to meet people at the door without asking them to prove they deserve respect. By the third morning, the pause felt less like a halt and more like a clean room. Work continued inside a contained field with clear edges and rules. The welcome team rotated in with fresh faces, 2 at a time, their scripts in view but not performed like theater. The sign was now bilingual because a late-night note pointed out that clarity should not depend on fluency. Facilities adjusted the lighting so that the counters were evenly lit and nameplates did not cast misleading shadows over faces. Small things, but small things are where people live. Upstairs, the audit group pinned their findings to a shared wall, column by column. Intake, verification, escalation, recovery. The pattern that had emerged looked simple on paper. Pressure and ambiguity created gaps. In those gaps, habit replaced judgment. A few habits had been learned in previous jobs where speed was worshipped and context was a luxury. A few had been learned here. The head of people wrote a single sentence across the top of the board: fix the environments, so the right choice is the easy choice. It stayed there as the day's headline. Legal finished its review of recordings and interviews. They confirmed violations of policy and recommended individual outcomes. A second document traced responsibility for outdated systems and ambiguous guidance that had made a bad choice faster to reach. The man in the dark turtleneck read both and signed both. Accountability without spectacle, remediation without denial. HR delivered the decisions to those involved, and they were told before anyone else. The message to the org would stay free of names and free of coded gossip. The story was the standard, not the cast. The COO and IT presented a plan to remove the most failure-prone steps from the welcome flow. The legacy visitor tool truncated names and forced workarounds that never felt neutral. It would be replaced, not patched. A small vendor with a clean design and transparent logging had been shortlisted. They did not promise to solve bias. They promised speed and audit trails. The CEO invited them to demo at a table in the lobby rather than in a quiet conference room. If a product failed under normal noise, it was not ready. The team tested it through a lunch hour and discovered a handful of frictions that the vendor agreed to fix within days. The decision was made on the spot. Contracts would include language that measured not only uptime, but the rate of successful first-pass check-ins across visitor types. Midday brought the second town hall. Cameras on again, chat open again. The CEO described what had been learned and what would change. He did not linger on the incident. He focused on systems, on language, on choices under time pressure. He asked leaders to stop treating grace as a perk and start treating it as a procedure. When the chat asked how they would measure success, he answered with a list. Fewer escalations at the desk, faster verifications, even distribution of friction across visitor categories. A quarterly review of anonymized cases to keep the organization honest, and a final measure that could not be faked, the tone in the lobby when something goes wrong. After the call, he met with frontline staff, not to deliver another speech, but to run drills. They practiced moments that usually pull people off balance. A late arrival for an executive who actually does have a meeting, a delivery that looks personal but contains equipment for a lab, a candidate who forgot a government ID but has 3 secondary forms. Each drill ended with a quick debrief. What did you feel first? What did you do second? What would be kinder and faster at the same time? The team wrote answers on index cards and taped them to the counter edge where only they could see them. Not to hide anything, to keep the right cues within reach when the day got loud. In parallel, customer success reopened a narrow lane. The pause on general operations would remain until the board review, but support for critical clients resumed with the new scripts and checkpoints. Calls that used to escalate into sharp exchanges now ran cooler because the language cut the drama out of the path. We hear you. Here is what we can do. Here is the next decision point. One caller asked if the company had changed owners. The agent smiled and said the company had changed something more important than paperwork. Late afternoon, the board convened in person for a special session. They expected a defensive briefing and instead received a plain narrative with timelines, numbers, and decisions already in motion. The CEO asked for endorsement of the policy updates, the vendor switch, and a budget line that formalized staffing buffers at the front desk. He also requested that the board adopt a standing practice. Every board meeting would now begin with an unfiltered report from the company's first 5 minutes of contact with the outside world. The chair looked around the table, then nodded. No one objected. They voted, and the measures passed. At close, the lobby felt different again. Not just quieter, but aligned. A courier came in with a package and left with a thank you and a confirmation barcode texted to his phone. A visitor checked in for an interview and received a one-page outline of the company's welcome process with a small box at the bottom that read, "Tell us if any step felt unclear or unkind." The box was not for show. The QR code sent feedback straight to a rotating inbox, watched by real people with authority to change things. The guard leaned against a column with an ease that comes from clarity, not from indifference. The man in the turtleneck stood by the door where his day had begun on the first morning. He watched 2 receptionists finish a shift change with a handoff that took less than a minute. Notes exchanged, a quiet laugh, a check of the clock. He did not try to freeze the moment for a poster or a brand video. He let it pass like good service always does. Standards, then systems, then habits. The company was not done. It was simply built on a foundation that could hold. Outside, a streetcar rattled by. Inside, a door opened for a guest who did not have to prove they deserved to be treated with basic respect. The 4th day began with a soft rain that made the city look scrubbed. Inside, the company resumed operations in measured steps. The reopening felt deliberate rather than triumphant. Departments worked from a staggered schedule, and the welcome team took the first shift as if they were opening a small shop that had to earn trust from one customer at a time. People arrived, read the sign, produced IDs, asked questions, and moved forward. It looked ordinary, which was the point. Upstairs, the audit group delivered its complete report. It contained no villains and no excuses. Charts showed when verification time spiked and why. Transcripts revealed how tone drifted when cues grew. The most telling page displayed a calendar heat map where stress and ambiguity overlapped almost perfectly with moments of poor judgment. The fix looked less like punishment and more like engineering. Clearer staffing bands. A rapid escalation line that actually answered. A tool that logged every choice so patterns could not hide under anecdotes. He thanked the team and asked them to publish a short version for every employee. Not as a victory lap, but as a map. Customer success reconnected with clients who had waited through the pause. The language they used had been rehearsed, but it did not sound scripted. We paused to protect standards. Here is what changed. Here is how it benefits you. Most clients responded with relief. One called to say that the company's honesty had made their own leaders reconsider how visitors were treated at their headquarters. The support floor ran quieter. Calls ended without frayed tempers. A few conversations even ended with the word thanks from both sides. By midday, the lobby received its first stress test since reopening. A power outage across the block sent unexpected visitors into the building to use meeting rooms and Wi-Fi. The counters filled with people who were late, hungry, and distracted. The welcome team moved with a steady rhythm. One handled intake, one handled exceptions. The guard kept the line organized without turning it into a checkpoint. The escalation line approved a dozen verifications in minutes. The sign held. The script was held. The tone held. No one raised a voice. When the lights across the street returned, the crowd thinned and the lobby fell back into an even pulse. The test had arrived uninvited and left behind proof. In the afternoon, the CEO met with a small group to discuss the training module that would become part of onboarding. He did not want a slideshow with staged photos and tidy slogans. He wanted a sequence of real cases with audio and timestamps and the choices people actually made under pressure. The head of people proposed a practice lab where employees would rotate through the desk for an hour in their first month. Not to play receptionist, but to learn how decisions feel when the room is busy and the timer is real. He approved it and asked that senior leaders take the rotation first. If a standard matters, it must touch the top of the org chart. The media finally reached out. A reporter asked for comment about a rumor that the company had shut down for 2 days over a front desk incident. He answered with the same clarity the town halls had used. We paused to complete transition controls and to correct a failure in how we greet people. We chose transparency and speed over spin. We are back to work with better systems. The reporter pushed for details about individuals. He declined. The story was not about a person. It was a pattern and a fix. The article that appeared later was cooler than he expected and more useful than he feared. It focused on operations, not outrage, and quoted an expert on service design. The company could live with that. At close of business, the board requested one more session, shorter this time. They reviewed first week metrics after the pause. Verification times had dropped. Escalations were more evenly distributed across visitor categories. Feedback from the lobby forum showed fewer comments about tone and more about clarity, mostly in the form of small suggestions that made the system better. The chair asked whether the company would keep the new practices after public attention moved on. The CEO said that public attention had never been the point. The board voted to embed the welcome measures into policy and to measure them the way they measured revenue and uptime. First contact would now sit on the same dashboard as core KPIs. He took the long way out through the lobby. The guard waved. The pair at the counter were in the middle of a shift handoff that sounded almost musical. The rain had stopped. Footprints on the tile faded as the air system did its work. He stood for a moment where the worst hour of the week had begun and thought about how easily a company can lose itself in its own speed. Then he thought about how quickly a company can recover when it treats dignity like infrastructure. On the sidewalk, a delivery driver leaned a bike against the wall and asked if the building was open again. "It is," the CEO said, and held the door. The driver nodded and wheeled inside with a grin that turned the lobby a shade brighter. The small moment did not make a memo or a metric, but it was the right picture to carry into the next week. Systems had been changed, habits were forming. The work ahead was not a campaign, it was maintenance. Respect at the door, every day, until it felt unremarkable again. Week 2 began with numbers rather than anecdotes. The dashboard on the executive floor refreshed at 7 each morning with 4 simple metrics: average verification time, proportion of exceptions handled within 1 minute, distribution of escalations across visitor types, and lobby sentiment pulled from short feedback notes. Green, green, yellow, green. The yellow flagged the distribution of escalations during the late afternoon window when back-to-back interviews overlapped with courier arrivals. The fix was not heroic. Facilities moved interviews by 15 minutes to avoid the delivery peak, and the welcome team added a micro shift that covered the crush. By the next day, the yellow eased to green. The vendor's new visitor system went live across 3 pilot floors. Names displayed fully, pronouns were optional. The system captured the exact moment a decision was made, not just the outcome, so the audit trail could show whether staff reached for help early or tried to push through uncertainty alone. In the first hours, 2 glitches appeared. The camera struggled with low light at the far side of the counter, and the privacy screen popped up too aggressively when someone leaned over to point at a name. The vendor shipped a firmware tweak by evening. The counter felt less like a checkpoint and more like a well-designed counter again. The company hired a manager of guest experience and placed the role in operations rather than marketing. Her first move was to map a career track from the desk to other parts of the business. If the front door sets the standard, then staffing it is not a dead end. She outlined rotations into customer success, facilities, security operations, and even sales for people who showed pattern recognition and calm under pressure. The change altered the energy around the counter. People stood taller when they could see where the work led. Midweek brought the first real challenge to the new standard. A visiting executive from a partner firm arrived late and tried to bypass the queue with a breezy apology and an older guest badge he had kept from a previous visit. The welcome team asked him to join the line. He bristled, then mentioned names. The team repeated the same line they had practiced. "We will move quickly, and we will treat you like everyone else." He waited, the check took 40 seconds, and the meeting started on time. Later, he sent a note that said he had not realized how often he relied on shortcuts and that the consistency felt like trust rather than friction. The team printed it and taped it behind the counter as a quiet reminder. Training rolled out in waves. New hires spent an hour at the desk during their first month. Senior leaders took the rotation too and left with a humility that cannot be borrowed from a slide. The most common surprise was how much tone changes the speed of a conversation. A calm opening shaved time off the verification because the visitor did not brace for a fight. The company began logging those deltas as real gains. Time is money, tone saves time. The media story that had worried everyone faded into the background. In its place came a smaller, steadier current of mentions from clients who noticed the difference without knowing the origin. A procurement lead wrote that visitors no longer shared hallway tales about frustration at the desk. A candidate said the process felt clear even when she forgot a document, and that the exception path treated her like a person rather than a problem. These notes mattered because they were not dramatic. They described a system doing quiet work. Inside the company, not all feedback was praise. One engineer complained that the new check-in for guest researchers took too long. The team examined the data and found the time had increased by 12 seconds because the script added a line about data handling rules. 12 seconds bought legal safety and fewer downstream clarifications. They kept the line. They also added a tiny pre-read link to calendar invites so guests could see the policy before arrival. The compromise cut the surprise without cutting the standard. Late in the week, the CEO stopped by the desk with two questions. What is still hard? And what would you never give up now that you have it? The team answered in plain terms. Hard is telling someone with status to wait their turn. They said they would never give up the back channel number that gets an empowered answer in under a minute. He nodded and asked them to write both on a card for the next town hall. On Friday, the building manager reported that noise complaints from the lobby had dropped even during rainy mornings. The data matched the feeling on the floor. A steady tone had replaced the brittle quiet that used to snap at the slightest nudge. The company did not declare victory. They added a recurring task to revisit scripts quarterly and to rotate a mystery guest program so habits never calcified. The front door no longer asked people to prove they deserved respect. It proved the company deserved their time. Week 3 opened with a different kind of pressure. The company was no longer proving it could keep order in the lobby. It was proving whether the change could travel past the front doors into vendor docks, conference centers, and client sites where the company wore someone else's badge. The operations team built a traveling welcome kit that fit in a carry case no larger than a laptop bag. It held a fold-out sign with the same plain language steps, a QR code for rights and options, a crib sheet for escalation, and a hotline card that bypassed switchboards. The first field test took place at a partner campus known for polished halls and rigid etiquette. The company staffed a small 2-person station outside a shared meeting suite. People arrived out of breath and late from a security bottleneck down the hall. The kit did not fix the building's rules, but it gave anxious visitors a steady place to land. The partner's facilities lead stopped by twice, then asked for the template. Back at headquarters, the guest experience manager launched the practice lab. The room looked ordinary on purpose. A counter, 2 stools, a clock, a camera for review. New hires rotated through a set of scripts while a coach adjusted variables in real time. a late courier with conflicting instructions, a researcher whose equipment needed a quick exception, a senior visitor who forgot identification and arrived with a story instead of documents. The point was to learn how it felt when clarity slipped, and how to reach for help before improvisation hardened into a bad choice. In the corner, a simple scoreboard tracked 2 numbers across sessions. Average time to seek assistance. Average time to resolve after assistance. The first number dropped each day. The second followed. Legal closed the incident file with a short memo that refused drama. Policies had been enforced. Processes had been amended. Training and staffing adjustments were documented. The memo named no one. It named only the expectations. People Operations finalized the exit for the former receptionist. She delivered a private apology through counsel that acknowledged harm without conditions. The CEO read it once, forwarded it to legal for the personnel record, and left it there. The next action was not to circulate the note. The next action was to ensure that no one was asked to carry the story as gossip. Customer Success proposed a quarterly listening loop with clients specifically about first contact, not just account performance. They built a short form with 4 prompts that focused on clarity, tone, and speed, and attached it to meeting follow-ups. Early responses showed that small assurances did most of the work. Thank you for arriving. You are in the right place. Here is what will happen next. When those sentences arrived early, people relaxed. When they were missing, the rest of the agenda felt brittle, even if the meeting went fine. Midweek, a contract negotiation brought a long line of attorneys and project leads to the lobby. The visiting firm arrived in staggered groups and tested every edge of the new flow. The welcome team ran their rhythm without shortcuts. When a senior partner tried to wave a colleague past the counter, the team smiled and kept the line moving. 40 minutes later, the visitor asked who had trained them. The answer was simple: everyone. The partner laughed and said he believed it. The board chair asked for a walk at dusk. No slides. They toured the quiet building and stopped near the counter where the week had started a month ago. The chair tapped the sign with a knuckle and asked how the company would guard against the slow slide back to old habits. The CEO answered with mechanisms rather than promises. The traveling kit, the lab, the scoreboard, the hotline, the rotation that reaches executives as well as assistants, the quarterly review with real cases and anonymized context, and a line on the dashboard beside revenue that cannot be green if the first 5 minutes are red. The chair nodded and said that was governance she could defend. On Friday, an unexpected storm flooded the street outside. Couriers arrived, soaked, interviews ran late, and the power flickered twice. The lobby did not snap. The team handed out spare towels from a box they now kept under the counter. The guard opened the secondary entrance to shorten the line. The escalation number approved fast exceptions. A candidate laughed through a wet handshake and told the counter staff that this was the kindest check-in she had seen anywhere. The comment did not make a press release. It mattered anyway. That night, the CEO drafted a note for the company. He did not mention the incident. He wrote about what it takes to keep a standard steady when no one is looking. He wrote that systems had been built to carry the weight and that people had chosen to use them. He closed with a plain commitment. The company would continue to measure how it greets the world and would keep adjusting until respect was ordinary. The message went out before sunrise. Morning arrived clear and bright. The doors opened. The counter hummed. The work continued. Week 4 began with a map on the wall. It showed every site where the company had a footprint, from the headquarters lobby to small satellite spaces inside client campuses. Colored pins marked which locations had received the new welcome kit, which had run practice labs, and which still relied on old instructions printed years ago. The operations team set a simple target. Each pin would move from pending to active within the month, not by decree, but by visits, drills, and gear that actually fit the way each place worked. At sunrise, a small team flew to a regional office known for high volume and narrow hallways. The welcome counter was a converted filing cabinet. Lines formed quickly and spilled into the elevator bank. The guest experience manager laid out the fold-out sign and the hotline card, then ran a half-hour session with the staff before doors opened. The first hour looked shaky because muscle memory fought the new flow. By mid-morning, the desk found its rhythm. Exceptions were routed in under a minute, and the hallway stayed clear enough for people to pass without hugging the wall. The team left behind a laminated script, a box of towels, a spare badge printer, and a short list of local tweaks that headquarters would adopt. Not every improvement needed to be invented in the biggest building. Back home, the metrics carried a quiet story. Verification times kept trending down. Escalations were now even across visitor categories, which meant friction had stopped clustering around particular names and faces. The sentiment notes read less like complaints and more like field reports. A courier wrote that someone finally explained where to wait when a package required a signature from a lab. A candidate shared that she did not feel rushed to apologize for forgetting a second ID because the exception path was offered before she asked. Midweek, an old habit surfaced. A senior manager emailed the desk to allow a favored partner to bypass check-in because he was late to present at all hands. The request landed in the welcome team inbox and tripped an automatic reply. We can move quickly, but we do not waive identification or purpose. The partner arrived, took 30 seconds to check in, and still made the talk. The manager later apologized for trying to rewrite the rules. He admitted that speed had once meant shortcuts and that he was still learning the difference between urgency and exception. The exchange became a case study for the practice lab within days. The lab itself gained texture. Coaches began weaving in audio from the busiest days so trainees could feel the pressure that makes small decisions brittle. The scoreboard continued to measure two numbers. Time to seek assistance dropped again as people learned to call the hotline before improvising, and resolution times held steady even with more complex scenarios. Leaders cycled through and left with annotated index cards about the moments where tone buys time. Those cards found their way to sleeves, wallets, and the underside of monitors. Legal and procurement closed the vendor contract with language that went beyond uptime. It required transparent logs, options to anonymize sensitive fields, and a quarterly review of how the tool handled edge cases. The vendor agreed to publish a changelog that staff could read. The point was not to generate applause, but to keep the system legible so no one had to trust a black box with human dignity. IT added a dashboard tile that anyone could open to see the same numbers the executive floor saw each morning. A client invited the company to run its welcome model at a conference they co-hosted downtown. The team set up a compact version at the entrance for speakers and guests. The ticket scanners belonged to the venue, but the rhythm belonged to the script. You are in the right place. Here is the next step. Need an exception. Here is the person to grant it. The line moved fast because people stopped bracing for conflict. At lunch, the venue manager asked for a copy of the checklist. The team printed it on the back of a program with a QR code that linked to a public version of the guide. It traveled farther than the press ever could. Late in the week, the CEO sat with a frontline roundtable again. A new hire spoke about the first time she told a high-status visitor to wait and how her hands shook until the system had her back. A security officer said the clearest change was not in compliance but in temperature. Arguments had turned into conversations. The CEO wrote 2 words on a notepad and left it on the counter when he stood to go. Quiet authority. It was not a slogan, it was a practice that could be measured and taught. Friday ended with a test that no one scheduled. A fire drill emptied the building into a damp evening, and the lobby suddenly had to clear and then process hundreds of people returning at once. The team broke the flood into lanes, scanned badges, verified guests, and used the hotline to approve edge cases without drama. 15 minutes later, the floors were steady. The drill ran like a real event because the habits were now real. The map on the wall lost 3 pending pins before midnight. The work to move the rest had already begun. Week 5 shifted from installing gear to installing habits in places that did not report to headquarters. A shared campus on the edge of town hosted a stack of tenants with mismatched rules and anxious lobby teams. The guest experience manager arrived at dawn with 2 staffers and a small cart that held the fold-out sign, the hotline card, and a paper packet labeled Field Playbook. Tenant leaders trickled in with coffee and competing opinions. One said the script would slow them down. Another said exceptions invited trouble. The manager listened, asked for the busiest hour on their logs, and proposed a live test at 11. If the hour ran faster and calmer, they would keep the kit. If not, she would pack it up. No speeches. A wager on practice. By 10:30, the line was already forming. A courier with multiple drop-offs, a speaker from a tech meetup, 2 candidates for different firms, A service vendor with an invoice that needed a signature upstairs. The local receptionist kept her post while a second staffer worked the escalation path. The hotline answered on the first ring. Exceptions cleared in under a minute. The floor led redirected candidates to a quiet waiting corner with a clear view of the board so they were not lost or last. At 11:50, the clock told a simple story. Throughput went up, voices stayed even. One tenant who had doubted the process asked to borrow the laminated scripts for the afternoon. The manager left the kit for a week and booked a follow-up date to see whether the change had stuck. Back at headquarters, the practice lab added a scenario that was less comfortable than a late courier. Coaches called it the mirror. A trainee played the role of a visitor who raised a concern about bias in real time. The person at the desk had to listen, acknowledge, and correct without getting defensive or hiding behind the process. The first attempts came out stiff. After a few rounds, people learned a sentence that did most of the work. You are right to flag that. Let me fix the steps I missed and explain our options. The mirror did not aim to create confessions. It trained the reflex to repair. Legal close, the last loose thread from the original incident. The personnel file was complete. Counseling resources had been offered to anyone who felt the event reopened old wounds. The CEO asked for a short debrief from the employee resource groups without turning them into a review panel. Representatives came with practical suggestions rather than slogans. Add phonetic fields to the visitor tool so names were not mangled over the intercom. Include a one-page note for interviewers that described the welcome process so candidates did not get mixed messages upstairs. Both changes took a day to implement and a week to feel normal. Midweek, a senior engineer brought up a concern with the dashboard. He questioned whether the even distribution of escalations really meant fairness or simply that staff had learned to game categories. The data team took the challenge seriously. They pulled random samples, blinded the cases, and asked a cross-functional review group to classify each escalation by type and complexity. The blind read matched the logs within a small margin. The engineer accepted the finding and suggested one more safeguard. Rotate who assigns categories each week. The change went in that afternoon. A client in another city asked for help redesigning the entry to their research wing. Their visitors included cautious academics, impatient industry partners, and students on their first professional visit. The company sent a small team with a traveling kit and a sketch pad. They spent a day watching where confusion collected. The hardest moments were predictable. An ID badge that did not work with older gates, a delivery that required sign-off from a lab where phones were not allowed. The team proposed two moves. Put a clear "now what" sign next to the broken reader with the hotline number in large print. Place a magnetized clipboard on the counter with checkboxes for the delivery steps so the guard did not have to recite policy while the line listened. None of it was flashy, all of it saved time. Inside the company, the rotation program reached a milestone. One of the first reception staffers moved into a role on customer success and brought with her a sharp eye for moments where tone and timing determine whether a ticket turns hard. She started sending tiny notes back to the desk about phrases that smoothed calls downstream. The path between the counter and the rest of the business no longer felt one way. It felt like a loop. On Thursday, a rumor surfaced that a famous investor was visiting. The lobby filled with extra attention and an itch to bend rules. The welcome team did nothing special. The person arrived, checked in, and took a seat. A junior employee whispered that they should have ushered him directly upstairs. The guard answered the way the lab had trained. We keep the same standard for everyone because it lets us move faster, not slower. 40 seconds later, the elevator doors closed on a quiet ride to the right floor. Friday ended with a town hall on small wins. The CEO spoke for less than 5 minutes. He named 3 numbers and 1 story. Verification times, resolution times, after assistance, and the share of escalations handled within 1 minute. Then the story of a visitor who came back to drop a note that read simply, "You saw me, thank you." The room did not cheer, it did not need to. People returned to work with the steady sense that they were building something that would hold in the weather. That night, the operations team updated the wall map. A few pins still waited to move. The team set their travel plan and printed fresh playbooks. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, the first 5 minutes of contact felt like part of the product rather than a lobby chore. The shift was not a headline, it was a habit, reinforced each morning by a dashboard that asked one question. Are we meeting people the way we say we do? Week 6 arrived with a visit no one could choreograph. An external auditor contracted by a major client scheduled a surprise facilities and process review. The note landed at dawn with a 2-hour window and a list of areas they planned to inspect, including first contact procedures. The building woke up a little straighter. The welcome team did not rehearse a performance. They ran the morning the way they had every day for a month. The auditor joined the line, watched the intake, asked for an exception on purpose to see how the back channel worked, and timed the response with a discreet tap on her watch. 48 seconds. She took a seat in the corner and began drafting her report on a tablet while the room kept moving. Upstairs, the operations group prepared a clean feed of the dashboard. No hidden charts, no internal commentary threads. If the numbers were not fit for outside eyes, they were not fit for the work. The auditor asked for a walk through the escalation path and a sampling of logs that showed how decisions were made. Legal and IT brought a cross-section that included a late courier, a candidate without a second ID, and a senior visitor who arrived with an old badge. The question she asked most often was simple. When did someone call for help? The answer was in the timestamps. Earlier now. Consistently earlier. Which meant improvisation was no longer the default solution. Mid-morning brought an unplanned stress test. A tenant upstairs held a product showcase that spilled into the lobby without warning. The line doubled. The guard set a secondary lane and the team split roles without looking over their shoulders. The auditor stepped out of the corner and stood near the counter to see whether the tone would fray. It did not. The script did not sound like a script. People were met, not processed. When the rush eased, she asked for a copy of the field playbook and the change log for the visitor tool. Transparency was becoming part of the air. The CEO visited the practice lab between meetings to watch a session called the Mirror Run with a mixed group from finance and engineering. The coach dialed the pressure up by piping in lobby audio from a day when the elevators were down. At the counter, a trainee stumbled once and tried to compensate by talking faster. The coach stopped the clock and reset the scene with a single prompt. Say less, mean more. The next attempt landed. You are right to flag that. Let me fix the steps I missed. The CEO left a note to add, say less, mean more to the index card set in the welcome kit. That afternoon, the board chair joined a quiet review with the auditor to hear preliminary impressions. She did not offer compliments, she offered facts. Verification times trending down. Early calls for help trending up. Even distribution of escalations across visitor types is confirmed by blind sampling. A clean record of decisions and a hotline that answered inside a minute. She added one caution. Standards fail at edges when attention drifts. Keep the rotation at the top, keep the quarterlies honest, keep the logs human readable. The chair thanked her and asked for one more thing. A paragraph the company could share with clients that described the shape of the improvement without leaning on a single story. The auditor agreed. Evening brought a different test. A contractor arrived with a damaged crate and a sharp temper. His delivery window was closing and he feared the penalty. The welcome team had practiced this more than once. Intake first, then options. We can hold the crate. We can escalate for a signature now. We can redirect to the dock with a timestamp that protects your fee. He chose the dock and left with a visible drop in his shoulders. The guard watched him go and said later that the counter had learned to trade heat for choice. Inside the company, the guest experience manager rolled out a small feature in the visitor tool that felt like a footnote but mattered. A phonetic note next to each name, visible on the desk monitor. A week later, feedback notes mentioned fewer mangled introductions. In hiring, the rotation through the desk began to change how managers interviewed. They asked candidates about pressure, not just skill. Tell me about a time you chose a slower step to protect a standard. People who had never worked a front desk could still understand the reflex. Near week's end of the week, the auditor submitted a brief. It was not a certificate or an award, it was a narrative that traced the company's first 5 minutes from greeting to exception and back to work. The report noted that bias had been addressed with mechanisms rather than slogans and that staff called for help early with no penalty. It also flagged one area to watch. Late afternoon overlaps that quietly rebuild pressure. The company responded the same day with a small schedule shift and a published plan to keep overlaps from becoming brittle zones. The reply was posted where any employee could read it. Governance is visible as an everyday habit. The week closed with a simple gesture in the lobby. A new hire arrived for orientation, took in the sign and the paired counters, and hesitated like someone who expected to be corrected. The receptionist met her eyes, said welcome, and explained the next two steps. The new hire exhaled. She laughed at herself and called it silly. It was not silly. It was the entire point embodied in one breath. A company chooses each morning whether respect will be rare or routine. The doors slid open. The first 5 minutes did what work should do. They made the rest of the day easier. Week 7 shifted the lens to after hours, the time when standards usually sag. The building felt different at night. The lobby lighting ran cooler, the hum of HVAC replaced chatter, and the desk sat with a single attendant while security roamed. Operations had already scheduled a pilot, duplicate the daytime two-person rhythm in miniature by pairing reception with a roaming shadow who could be summoned to the counter within 60 seconds. The first evening proved why it mattered. A research team arrived late with a fragile shipment, a candidate came early for a dawn interview after a red-eye flight, and a vendor needed a supervisor's signature before a loading dock would release parts. 3 needs, 1 desk. The shadow system absorbed the overlap without forcing the lone attendant to improvise or stonewall. Response time averaged 55 seconds across the rush window. The board dashboard got a new row labeled Night Integrity. Upstairs, engineering proposed a small change with a large effect. Push the welcome kit into the product itself. The company's client platform now carried a visiting use module that embedded the same plain language steps and the hotline. Clients could toggle it on for their own front desks. Legal vetted the language, InfoSec reviewed logging, and customer success volunteered to pilot with 5 accounts known for heavy foot traffic. The module launched with 3 sentences and a QR code. You are in the right place. Here's what happens next. Need an exception. The first week showed a quiet drop in confusion at both ends of the visit. People operations rolled out a new piece of onboarding. Every manager would now spend 1 hour sitting next to the desk during their first quarter and another hour 6 months later. Not to surveil, but to witness how policy meets breath. The reports that came back read like field notes. A VP wrote that the hardest moment was telling a friendly regular that rules had shifted and then waiting out the awkward pause. A new manager noticed that apologies were spent early and saved minutes later. The notes fed the practice lab scripts and hardened one conviction. Leadership cannot delegate culture from a slide. Midweek brought a strain the metrics could feel. A social post mischaracterized the original incident, claiming the company had punished a receptionist for refusing to bow to VIP culture. The narrative traveled fast because outrage travels fast. Communications drafted a statement, but the CEO resisted a defensive posture. They posted what had been public all along: the town hall notes, the audit summary, the auditor's paragraph describing trend improvements, and the ongoing changes to tooling and schedules. No names. No theater. They added one new data point: how early calls for help had risen and how resolution times had dropped without widening gaps between visitor types. The post read like an open playbook. The spike cooled in 2 days. Where rumor offered heat, the logs offered shade. That same day, a partner site reported a near miss. A temp guard, new to the building, tried to wave through a late speaker because the queue looked long. The host company's desk caught it and reset the flow with a kindness that did not bend. The partner's facilities lead sent a note of thanks and asked for the 1-page training brief used in the practice lab. The company shared it and added a reminder to their own rotation. Standards fail at edges unless you flood the edges with clarity. The welcome kit gained 2 unglamorous items after a quarterly demo: a small stapler and pre-printed exception slips with checkboxes and a timestamp. The change came from watching hands. Staff wrote the same notes over and over during complex moments, and handwriting slowed the line. The slips codified the pattern without turning the counter into a ticket booth. Tiny frictions removed, not by edict, but by noticing. Night Integrity surfaced another pattern by Thursday. The hardest moments occurred during shift handoffs, when the single attendant mentally clocked out a few minutes early to brief the incoming shift. The fix was not scolding. The fix was to overlap. 5 minutes of paid overlap at shift change, recorded as a scheduling rule rather than a be better speech. Metrics improved the next evening and stayed there. Friday brought a different kind of visitor, a high school cohort touring careers. Teenagers watched the counter run and asked blunt questions that adults softened. Why can't you just trust people? Why do you make someone important wait? The team answered with the sentence the practice lab had polished to its simplest form. We go faster when we treat everyone the same. The teacher later emailed that 3 students had never seen a lobby that made them feel expected instead of tolerated. The message joined the wall of quiet notes behind the desk, the ones that fuel work better than headlines. The week closed with a roundtable of frontline staff and systems owners. They reviewed night integrity, the product module, the rumor spike, the partner near miss, and the tiny addition of a stapler. None of it looked cinematic. All of it looked like governance. The CEO ended with the same 4 measures he had carried from week 1 and added a 5th. How often do we fix a friction we did not know to look for until a colleague pointed it out? The room nodded. That metric had no perfect baseline, but it spoke to a habit that would keep the standard alive when attention drifted. The doors locked for the night, the counter light dimmed, the system held. Week 8 started with a new constraint that would have broken the old system. The building next door began renovations and funneled its overflow through shared hallways, pushing noise and foot traffic into the lobby. Facilities rerouted stanchions to keep sightlines clear from the entrance to the desk. The welcome team treated the first hour as a live drill. Intake, options, escalation. A supervisor floated near the line with a tablet, scanning for confusion before it hardened into friction. The counter held even as the decibel level rose. At 9:30, a courier joked that it felt like a train station with manners. That was close to the goal. Upstairs, data showed a mild uptick in afternoon escalations again. Not a surge, just a seam. The cause turned out to be seasonal interviews stacked against end-of-quarter vendor visits. Operations split the seam by blocking 2 tiny windows on the room booking system. 15 minutes mid-afternoon now belonged to the desk for catch-up and reset. The calendar change looked small and felt huge. Staff stopped carrying backlog stress from 1 hour to the next. Decision quality traveled with that relief. The practice lab refreshed its scenarios with cases from partner sites. One was a campus where names were long and unfamiliar to staff, trained on old systems. The phonetic field in the visitor tool had already helped, but the lab added a drill that taught a simple check. Ask how to say it, repeat it once, and move on. The drill was not about decorum. It was about accuracy and pace. People move faster when they hear themselves respected. The scoreboard recorded the same 2 numbers it always had. Time to ask for help. Time to resolve after help. Both stayed low, even as the lab raised complexity. Legal and procurement convened a review with the vendor to test edge cases. What happens when the network drops? What happens when power flickers? The answers were clear enough to trust. Local cache, visible fallback steps, and a flag in the log that made it obvious when staff worked in contingency mode. The point was to prevent a scramble that turned a visitor into a stress test. IT published the contingency guide next to the morning dashboard, and the team ran a brief drill after lunch. When redundancy is practiced, it stays quiet in the real event. Midweek, the company hosted a mixed cohort of candidates for a rotational program. They arrived from airports and trains with mismatched documents and nerves. The counter ran the rhythm that had become second nature. Welcome. Here is what happens next. Here is what we can do if a piece is missing. The hallway feels different when those sentences come early. A candidate later wrote that she stopped bracing for a test she did not know how to pass. The note landed in the same quiet folder where the team stored their best feedback. The folder served as fuel when attention drifted. The product team released a small improvement to the external module that clients could enable. It now displayed average verification times in real numbers rather than colored dots. The transparency felt risky to some leaders until they realized it reduced speculation. When people see the number, they stop telling stories about what they think is happening. A client adopted the module across 3 sites and sent a thank you that sounded like a lesson. You cannot argue with a clock, you can only improve. Inside the company, the rotation through the desk reached engineering leadership. A senior architect kept his hour and left with a sketch of a lighter weight fallback badge flow for visitors who needed restricted Wi-Fi for short windows. He met with security, ironed out the risk, and shipped a prototype that saved minutes without loosening control. The counter staff noticed the change immediately. Less back and forth, fewer reprints, one less reason for tone to fray. A rumor surfaced of another media piece, this one more curious than accusatory. It framed the lobby as part of the product and asked to film a day in operations. The company declined filming but offered a written walkthrough and the public pieces already posted. The story ran without faces and read like a case study rather than a spectacle. It quoted the auditor's paragraph and mentioned the visiting module. No one on the desk had to carry the weight of a camera while doing real work. The system remained the story. Toward week's end, the shared hallway renovation spilled dust and uncertainty into the building again. A temporary barricade forced a single-file entry during the lunch rush. The welcome team and security drew a narrow path with tape and kept voice levels steady. The hotline took a dozen calls for quick exceptions and answered all under a minute. The guard handed out a few disposable shoe covers to contractors so the floor stayed safe. The log later showed a small rise in verification time, offset by a sharper drop in escalations. People accepted slower steps when they felt guided rather than judged. Friday closed with a review the CEO called the quiet report. The same four numbers opened the session, and the fifth, the measure of frictions discovered by colleagues rather than leaders, had ticked up. Examples included a simple request to add a small ledge under the counter for visitors to set a bag while they reached for ID, and a tweak to the script that moved the named question after the purpose so people did not feel interrogated before they knew why it mattered. None of it would make a poster, all of it made the day smoother. The board chair listened and asked whether the routines would survive 6 months out when novelty wears off. The answer pointed to mechanisms, not mood. Rotations on the calendar, the lab scoreboard, the tools logs, the external modules clock, the overlap rule at shift change, stanchions and signage that assume confusion rather than scolding it. The lobby settled into evening with the measured calm that comes from practice rather than luck. A last visitor dropped off a sealed envelope for legality and left with a receipt printed from the new slips. The guard did a final walk of the hall. The map on the wall added another pin in the active column. The company did not feel heroic. It felt competent. The difference is what keeps a standard alive when the week ends and the building empties. Monday would bring fresh noise. The first 5 minutes were ready. Week 9 did not open with a crisis or a visitor of note. It opened with the routine that everyone had built together. The lobby took its first breath at 7 as lights rose from dim to steady. The welcome team checked the overnight log, skimmed the dashboard, and reset the slips and towels, the pens, and the small stapler that had earned its place. A new hire arrived 10 minutes early for her first desk rotation and stood beside the counter where so much had shifted. She watched the rhythm without being told where to look. Intake, options, escalation. The sentences landed softly and in order. She practiced them under her breath like lines in a small play whose audience would be one person at a time. Upstairs, operations pushed a quarterly packet to the board and to every manager. It was long on numbers and short on prose. Average verification time over 8 weeks. Percentage of exceptions resolved within 1 minute. Evenness of escalations across visitor types confirmed by blind reads. Trends at the edges that needed attention. Night integrity status, with the shift overlap rule circled as the quiet hero. A page at the back displayed the queue of tiny frictions found by colleagues. The bag ledge had shipped. The script tweak that moved purpose ahead of name had lowered defensiveness and sped intake by a measurable handful of seconds. Another entry proposed adding a small pitcher of water behind the counter for people who arrived flustered. 2 receptionists marked it with a check and a note. We already brought cups from the break room. A pitcher would save steps. Mid-morning, a partner company visited to compare notes on their own lobby changes. They had heard the stories, then seen the public module and the auditor's paragraph, and wanted to walk the flow. The guest experience manager led a loop that began at the door and ended at the practice lab. They watched a run-of-the-mirror scenario and stood still during the silent minute when a trainee learned to say less and mean more. The partner asked whether the company planned to package the program as a product. The manager said they were not in the certification business, they were in the keep promises business. If the tools helped others, they would share them. If not, the work would still be worth it. The auditor's final report arrived in email. It confirmed trend improvements and described the mechanisms that kept attention honest. It flagged one seam that would always need care. Late afternoons in the last week of a quarter, the company responded with a date-stamped plan to protect those windows with staffing and scheduled breath. The reply was posted for all employees to see, not because the audit theater earns praise, but because visibility builds memory. Midweek brought a field trip. A small team took the traveling kit to a community job fair in a high school gym where power cords and cardboard signs did the work of walls. Lines thinned and swelled with the bell schedule. The team set up a mini counter at the entrance and used the same sentences they would use in the building. You are in the right place. Here is what happens next. Need an exception. A student stepped up, eyes wide, and admitted she did not know how to talk to anyone in a suit. A receptionist handed her the laminated script and said the secret was that adults use scripts too. The line moved. The habit traveled. Inside, leadership continued the rotation. A director of sales took an hour beside the desk and left with a note to change how reception alerts upstairs when a client arrives. A simple heads up triggered earlier prep and cut waiting in conference rooms that once frayed tone. Engineering shipped the fallback badge flow from pilot to standard. The tool's changelog reads like a journal of small promises kept. No one admired it for style. They relied on it for truth. Late in the week, a quiet ceremony took place without speeches or photos. One of the first reception staffers who had asked hard questions in week 1 received an internal transfer to facilities strategy. She had spent months noticing patterns and catching seams before they split. Now she would shape the map itself. The team clapped at the counter, a small sound swallowed by the normal noise of a building at work. Career paths had become tangible in a way the original incident could not have predicted. Friday's town hall carried no drama. It opened with the dashboard, then a short story chosen for its ordinary scale. A candidate arrived with a name that staff had stumbled over in past versions of the system. The phonetic field did its job. The exchange took seconds. The candidate later wrote that her first impression was not that a company had perfected hospitality, but that it respected time and names equally. The CEO closed with the first sentence he had used weeks earlier. We go faster when we treat everyone the same, he added a second. We stay faster when we practice on quiet days. The evening settled without incident. The guard made a last pass, the counters were wiped, the picture note on the friction board turned into a purchase order. The map on the wall lost another pending pin as a satellite site reported that the kit had taken root. The system did not feel new anymore. It felt like a path worn smooth by feet that chose it again and again. The building emptied. The clock over the desk clicked to the hour. Nothing remarkable happened, which was the most remarkable outcome available. A company that had once treated the first 5 minutes as a lobby chore now treated them as part of the product. Standards held without being announced. Scripts breathed without sounding scripted. When the doors locked, the lobby did not carry the week as a burden. It held it as proof. Monday will come. People would arrive, tired or late or proud or nervous. The counter would be ready, not because a crisis demanded it, but because a habit had formed, and habits, once earned, keep working even when no one is watching.